Testing the mic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's me. E. Guess we'll just start the podcast again. Guess we'll just start the podcast again, Morrow. We've recorded 2 episodes already. Guess we'll just start the podcast again. Hi, everyone. It's Eric here with Amari, Morrow, Mary, Kimberly. And we're here with Gariot, the Vice President for Strategic and Diversity. You didn't put the rest of his title on here. You didn't put the rest of the title. Today we're here with
Gariot Louima. I am the Vice President for Strategic and Diversity Initiatives. I serve as Earlham's Chief Diversity Officer.
Thank you, Gariot, for being here with us today. We just have a couple of quick questions for you, just as like overview of what DEI is, how it applies like on campus and things of that nature. For our first question, we'll start off with something pretty basic, which is what is DEI and what is DEI not?
So DEI is an umbrella term, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the context of higher education or any other institution, it describes the policies, processes, practices to ensure that the community is diverse, it's not homogenous, that the community treats folks equitably, and that could include everything from offering accommodations for folks with disabilities, and that the institution is inclusive, that it welcomes and celebrates people from a variety of backgrounds. And that can include a variety of policies and practices, including policies to prevent discrimination and harassment, to supporting first-generation college students. What DEI is not is racial preferences on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, in the ways that some folks have talked about it nationally. And DEI is not about making people feel bad about the ways in which they might have been born. That's actually opposite of what DEI is supposed to be in the context of an institution.
Thank you. And with your work with DEI, what are some challenges that you face with implementing DEI initiatives and policies on college campuses?
I think the biggest thing that is a challenge is the understanding that the work of DEI is never complete, particularly in the context of the US. That we will never get to a point where our campuses are fully inclusive, diverse to the extent that it represents the population of the US or the world, or that we will always get it right when it comes to equal opportunity and equitable treatment on campuses. But the flip side is, as a person doing DEI professionally, is that you know that your work is connected to institutional mission. You have the support of a board and of a faculty, and that you have students who remind you when you don't do the thing right. And so it's you do the work with the understanding that the work is never done. And then you also do the work with the understanding that as the diversity officer, you may or may not have the authority to change a practice or to change a policy, but you have access to people who have the authority to make those decisions. And so part of your job is to continue to press them to do better by the mission of the institution.
I think you touched a little bit on it, but could you talk more about why DEI is important, particularly on college campuses, and more specifically why those kind of policies are important here, like on our own college?
Yeah, I always think about DEI in the context of mission. So my last several colleges have been smaller liberal arts colleges that have embedded in their mission and their vision this desire to be welcoming to people from all backgrounds. And DEI work is important to keep an institution honest as to whether or not it is trying to live up to its mission. So in the context of Earlham College or any other undergraduate institution of higher education, DEI is a recognition that all of your students don't have the same economic background. They don't come to you with the same access to education, the same access to resources, and that when your students arrive at your campus, it becomes your responsibility to support those students the best you can so that those students persist and that they graduate. And as an employer, it's your job to ensure that when you hire people, you treat people respectfully and equitably in the space of your campus. And that if individuals mess up, if individuals do things to create sort of a hostile work or study environment, you have in place a mechanism to hold people accountable, that you have due process if indeed, for example, there's a Title IX violation on your campus, or someone says that they've been subject to racial discrimination or harassment on your campus. You have a formal process by which you hold folks accountable, but that you have a due process in place that people understand. So I think for all of those reasons, it's important. And for a college like Earlham, where we say our mission comes from Quaker practice, we say that we're committed to equality of persons and to integrity and community, DEI describes the general mechanism that you have in place to hold the institutional accountable to its own stated values.
And what would you say to college campuses or people trying to better implement DEI policies? How can they work to create sustainable policies and practices that can withstand changes like in political climates?
That's the question of the ages. I think the general advice that I give is the same advice that I get from some of my colleagues at other institutions. Like, how do you sustain an institution, but also the professionals who are doing the work, is to remember the mission of the institution, that regardless of what happens in the political sphere, an institution is accountable to its stated mission and values. And so you remember those as sort of your North Star, that if indeed there is some legal change that comes from the federal government or from the state of Indiana or from your accreditors, you go back to what is the mission of the organization. Does you think about whether or not compliance of the letter actually makes you diverge from mission. And then I think the added thing I think about at a religiously affiliated institution is, how does an action make the institution waver from or further commit itself to its deeply held religious principles? And so I think it's about asking those questions in the face of obstacles, but also continuing to do the work as best you can to support the folks who are in your community. Doesn't mean that it's easy. It means that you have on speed dial college attorneys so you can get some advice on what you're legally obligated to do. It means having honest conversations, like in a faculty meeting or with students when you're asked questions. But also it means that even before you are faced with a challenge, that you are constantly working toward doing better at sticking to your mission.
Is there anything else you would want to tell the Earlham student body kind of about this topic? You know, people are worried, but what would you say to them?
The thing I would say is probably the thing that we've said in faculty meeting and staff meeting, is that regardless of the series of executive orders or any dear colleague letters from the Department of Education, Earlham is still committed to its mission and to its principles and practices, and those don't change simply because there are orders from the federal government. That we owe it to our community to hold to that mission. And that's sort of where we are right now. There are no major changes to institutional policy as a result of conversations in the media or executive orders on the question of whether or not DEI is a valid practice in higher education. We are still beholden to federal laws on discrimination and harassment, but our mission is as our mission has always been, and we'll continue to hold to that. And if at some times we have to defend our mission, we'd be prepared to do that too.
Okay, like for you personally, how do you feel about like everything that has been going on related to DEI, and especially like that being your position for a while? Like, how do you feel about like what's going on right now?
In some ways, it's frustrating because when I read the executive orders or when I hear about the ways people talk about DEI in the media, it's not the work of DEI. Like, DEI is not about making white people feel sad about anything. It's not about creating racial preferences that are unfair to people. The work of DEI is about trying to create fairness and inclusion on college campuses. So in that respect, it's frustrating. Certainly as somebody who does DEI work, I think I take some comfort in the fact that I work at a private school and at a religious school. I know that there are folks nationally whose jobs are changing dramatically, or who don't have jobs because they do this work and because certain segments of our country are misinterpreting the work that they do. But then there are also other executive orders that I think about as you know, mine is an immigrant family. My family's from Haiti. I was born in the Bahamas and came to this country on a boat when I was 1, I think. And until after college, I was a person without citizenship anywhere. And so I can understand how executive orders that that take away legal protections from folks who might be in this country even legally creates an uncertainty and upsets lives in a way that I don't think is necessarily humane. But then when I think about the executive orders and how it relates to my own job, in some ways I have to, for the sake of sanity, separate what is my own personally held conviction with what is the institutional mission and how it stands in the world. And as a professional, when I think about the DEI work and what I may or may not say about executive orders, I always take 2 seconds to pause about what I'm gonna say, because when I speak as a DEI officer, and so I speak as an employee of Earlham. But I do appreciate that question. Generally, in the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about the executive orders in the context of my work, and I think only one other person asked me the question about, like, what about you personally? Do you think about this? And that other person was also a student, so I do appreciate that question.
I'm kind of curious, you kind of mentioned how this isn't your first position as like DEI, as higher education and things like that. I'm curious to know how, over the years that you've worked in this kind of position, how things have changed for you, or how things have changed for DEI, and how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think for me, this is the first time I've been the institution's primary diversity officer, but in my previous work, DEI has always been sort of part of it. So I've worked in marketing offices at minority serving institutions. When I did enrollment management, it was always with a view to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, how do we reach out to the broadest possible collection of students? Right before coming to Earlham, I worked at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, and I also worked at Goddard College. And those are both very progressive curricularly, but also politically institutions. And so every time we talked about policy, procedure, student retention, we talked about it with a view to equitable education, which would be in DEI. How do we ensure that the students that we recruit to a school have the same opportunities to graduate, to persist and graduate despite whether or not they're first-gen students of color or immigrant students. So in some ways, DEI has always been embedded in the way I thought about my work professionally. It certainly informed the work I did before I came into higher education. I worked as a newspaper reporter. And so I've always thought about the ways in which society treats its citizens, or those who are not citizens. And in some ways, I've been drawn to colleges that have missions that I feel I can support. I've not yet worked at a college where I felt as if the mission is completely contrary to my own personal belief system. But I think what has changed is the ways in which folks have talked about DEI in national spaces. That folks talked about DEI for a long time is an admirable thing for a college to aspire to, and it's dramatically so in the last several years. DEI, critical race theory, those things have been described as an attempt for institutions to discriminate against certain segments of society, and that mischaracterization, I think, is frustrating to witness.
Earlham, as an institution, we know, is very diverse in the way of like domesticated versus internationals. So I'm curious to like how does DEI differ for internationals versus like us domestic students? Is there a difference between it? Because I feel like on social media there is like this concept that there are two different versions of it for international versus like us domestic students. And so I guess for your perspective, is there a difference? Is there a true difference, or is it like a social media tale that's going on?
A lot to address this, but I think there are different ways in which domestic students of color and international students of color experience ERLM. But I also think that there's an intersection sometimes, depending on the individual's identity, about how they might experience barriers at ERLM and at any other PWI, right? Like, so when we think about how a college like ERLM might have been developed, it was developed by Quakers who moved to the Midwest. The first ERLMites at the, I think it was called the Quaker Academy, were not necessarily students who looked like our most diverse students on this campus. And ERLM, like other institutions, may have had ideas about equality of persons, but just like the rest of the country, it's taken a while for people to evolve what that understanding is. And so I think if you're an international student who comes to ERLM and you've read about ERLM, let's say you go to a UWC school, you've read about ERLM, you might think that the ways in which we do equality or human rights is similar to what you experience on your UWC campus. You come to ERLM is in the Midwest, ERLM doesn't feel like the thing that you might have read. And I think that happens too if you are a domestic student of color, if you are a non-Quaker and you come to ERLM's campus, you might have an idea of what ERLM might aspire to, but then you begin to experience the mechanisms of the institution. Some things that are controllable by the administration, some things that are not, like what you might be reading in the classroom, the ways in which other students might respond to you. All of those things are uncontrollable variables. So in some ways, I think whether a person is a domestic student of color or an international student of color, when they come to this campus, there's going to be a moment in which there's a pause, and folks will begin to reconcile who is the institution, that the institution exists in the space of the world, and it might have some aspirations and some stated values, but it also is an institution made up of a bunch of flawed people who won't always get things right. I think that's one part of the answer. The other part of the question that I hear, and I could be wrong in hearing this, how is ERLM aspiring to be the most diverse institution if indeed it is, there is not parity, I think, when I think about diversity of the student population. We generally recruit a healthy number of international students because of our longstanding relationship with Davis Foundation and United World Colleges. And it's harder for us, I think, to recruit domestic students of color, specifically Black students and Latinx students. And part of that, I think, is trifold. Part of that has to do with the cost of attendance here, the location of the institution, and then where we are located makes it difficult sometimes for students to make the decision to come to school here. I know that folks, for example, in admissions, like Erin Hutchinson, for example, does a phenomenal job. She recruits at all UWC schools, and she leads that team in admissions to go out and try to recruit the broadest number of students. But what occurs when you look at the numbers is at the point of decision, is a student and their family going to make the choice to come here, or do they go to Ohio State University, or do they go to Kenyon, or do they go to name the other school? And that's a thing that we can't always control because domestic students of color don't have access to Davis Foundation funds in the same way that international students who go to UWC might.
My question was just going to be like, how can ERLM's DEI improve, or what ways the room for improvement? But you touched on that already.
Yeah. I think we always have work to do to improve how we do things. And sometimes it's easier to put in place certain policies, but the thing about a policy is it's only as good as whether or not people pay attention to the policy. And so a continued program of educating folks, specifically employees of the institution, about what are our obligations, what is allowable, what it's not. And then also finding new ways to support employees and students where they are and in the ways that they'd like to be supported. And that's not always easy because folks have different needs. And then there's also the recognition that we have a pretty diverse community in terms of political perspective, worldview, background, and part of being a diversity officer is I have to think about ensuring that ensuring that even if person has a political perspective that is completely contrary to perspective that I hold, part of the challenge of the work is ensuring that the college also has a space for those voices. And that's not always personally easy to do. But yeah, it's just recognizing we always have room for improvement. And I encourage folks to tell us when we mess up and how we mess up. It's difficult, I think, sometimes for folks to give us feedback, or even like I work out of the president's office and I had a conversation with a colleague who told me that folks don't necessarily go to you because you're in the president's office. I'm like, well, I hope folks understand that my location in the president's office is strategic. If someone messes up, then the president's office should hear about it because the buck stops at the president's office. How do we hold people accountable if the leadership is unaware? And even if the leadership is aware, having me located in the president's office and serving as a liaison to a board committee ensures that there's sort of like a upstream and downstream level of accountability. That part of it is also sometimes difficult to maintain, but it's still there, at least, I think.
Well, if there are no additional questions, once again, I'd just like to thank you for your time, Gariot, and appreciate you coming on to this episode of the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
No problem.
What's your sign off? Do you do that ends another podcast?
I was. Guess we'll just sign off on the podcast again. Get ready to tune in next time. Do we know the topic yet? No, but you gonna find out soon. All right, we out of here, y'all.